So picking up where I left off in the last part, I basically have the rough frame all done, and I'm going to be adding the top side rails. So I went around and I put some blue tape on all the tops because I'm going to have to route a groove on the top side. That's how I'm going to connect the rails with splines. And taking it apart, I didn't want to get my sides messed up, so I just put tape on stuff like that. It's really easy visual reminder of which side needs the groove. While it was apart, I also wanted to taper the legs. You can leave them square, but I decided to put a taper on them, which is funny because when I finally assembled this, I put the taper on the wrong side. I'm not taking it apart to fix it, but essentially it just gives a little bit more of a design to the legs so they're not square, and the taper is supposed to traditionally go on the inside edge of the furniture. So I'm just doing these two cuts. You can see I just put a jig. I just kind of clamped a rudimentary jig onto my saw to get the rough angle I wanted. I basically wanted a little bit of an angle without removing too much material. And like I said, this taper is supposed to be cheated to the inside of the furniture, but on the final assembly, mine got a little messed up. And like I said, I'm not fixing it now that it's all together. And then I'm going to put this groove down the 2x6s for the spline. I'm just using 1/2-inch plywood for the spline. It's a pretty beefy spline, but I didn't want the cantilever to move once it was in place. And like I said, I put blue tape on the top side because on this one I'm cutting it where the lap's facing up, but some of them it's going to get cut with the laps facing down. And then like I said, when I first assembled this, it was a little too tight, so I just went through with a rasp and cleaned up all of the edges. I did this on all the legs with the boards until everything fit. You can see I'm picking up some high spots with the rasp, so once I got those down, everything fit pretty nicely. Now I made this over the course of quite a few months, so the humidity would come back to haunt me a little bit later, and I would have to do this again. But for now, you could see everything slides in there quite nicely. I have that groove along the top, and then I could reassemble this essentially. Before I did that, I just added another little decorative element to all of my corners. It's just a little 45, about 1 inch in off the edge that I put on there, and once again, not necessary, but it does give it a little bit more of a finished look on those edges. So then I could put the legs in place. I did a little bit differently this time. I slid the legs over those boards and then put those in place, and then did the other two edges. And like I said, sanding this down, this went together much nicer. You can see what I mean by that taper faces on the inside. And then this is my groove. Now the groove I didn't bother centering, so I made sure when I put my rails in place, you could see there's a thicker edge and a thinner edge. I just made sure that thinner edge was facing out on all of my boards, so when I put my rails on top, it matches. You can go through the process of centering it, but for stuff like this, it was easier to just run it right, eye it up, run it right through, and like I said, I just made sure that all of the edges match on the outer side. And then I could just put this together, and then that is what that looks like. You could see the thickness difference a little bit better now. And that is basically the frame with those grooves. You could do this before assembling it the first time, but I was a little impatient the first time. I wanted to see what it looked like. And then I'm back to those 2x6s. Now these ones, I specifically pick these out so they have a really nice grain pattern. With Douglas fir, you can get lucky and find some really 2-tone to even 3-tone grain patterns on this stuff. And I bought this stuff all at different times, so I'm going to go through and plane this stuff down the same way I did that first stack. It started off at 1.5 inches. I'm going to bring it down to about 1.25 inches, 1 inch and 5/16. I just think that using dimensional lumber looks better when it's not as thick. And then you could see using the scrap how I'm going to have that cantilever. So the thickness of the wood is going to come to the edge of the cantilever, and that is basically what that's going to look like. You don't have to do such a large cantilever, but I liked the way that this looked. So I just ripped my boards down. These are about 5.5, and I'm taking them down to about 5. I'm taking off both edges so I have a nice clean edge. I wanted all clean lines on this. You can see as I send these through the saw just how nice the grain pattern is on some of these boards. And then the groove is going to be filled with splines, like I said, and this is 1/2-inch ply. I usually have this sort of stuff hanging around the shop. Really, you can make your splines out of anything you have. I'm just using ply because I had it. And then all I have to do is take that material, rest it on top of where I need to cut the receiving groove, and you can see I put marks there, and then I'm going to cut it. Now, like I said, I was making this over the course of multiple months, so I'd work on it in bits and pieces. Ideally, I could have cut the grooves in the rails, planed all my lumber at one time, cut the grooves in the rails and the grooves on the top side cantilever rails all at the same time. That would have saved a lot of time, but my process was a little bit different for this one. If you're building something like this on your own, you could do all of those cuts at once, and this will be a faster build. Once I sent them to the saw, I could put my splines in place, mark them, put them in place, and then put my pieces on. So as you can see, this one is not going to overlap because these bottom pieces have to be able to come up. So these are the ones that are going to run edge to edge, and then the longer sides, technically the longer sides of the mattress, will be cut shorter because they have to come off second. Once they're in place, you could see it wasn't perfect. I planed this stuff, but I didn't joint it or anything like that. So as long as you put that inch on the outer edge, if this isn't totally square, it's not going to make as big of a deal within reason. And as you can see, the cantilever is not super flush. You don't even notice it now that there's blankets and stuff on the bed. So parts of this build are a little forgiving, which is nice. And then I could just line everything up and cut them down to size. Now, within reason, these bed rails, the top side, even though I cut everything flush, these top sides cantilevers, you're going to notice them shrinking and expanding with the seasons. So I cut everything flush, but they're not going to stay totally perfect. I'm going to glue up my two ends at once. You can see I put blue tape on everything I didn't want glue to get on. This glue is super strong. If you accidentally glue this together, getting it apart is going to be a real pain. Whenever I've had to take joints apart with Titebond 3, usually what happens is the wood will splinter apart before the glue joint breaks. And then you can see I could come in the next day, take all my clamps off, take all that tape off. It's extremely strong. I was really happy with how strong that cantilever is. Standing on it, it barely moves. And then I could do the exact same thing to the other sides, tape everything, make sure nothing is going to stick. And I'm not going to show a bunch of this because it's the exact same process. I didn't film this, but you can see as the two edge of these boards have pocket hole screws in there, and that was just because this one especially isn't really resting on anything on the edges. So I assume that over time, especially if you're stepping on it or leaning against it, it might sag a little bit. So I don't attach them until the end of the build, but I'm happy I put those there. Pocket hole screws are one of those things, I don't use them a ton in the shop, but when they serve their purpose, they serve it quite well, and that will keep that whole outer frame attached. So for inside here, I'm putting two center partitions. All I did was take a whitewood 2x6, I split it in half, so this is a little over 2.5 inches, and then I'm going to attach those with dovetails. I'm going to have dovetails inside the frame, and then those two white pieces will have the receiving end of those. It will just keep everything together. Now you don't have to do dovetails like I'm doing. You don't need a fancy tenoning jig to do these. I'm just cutting them real quick, cleaning them up on the radial arm saw, and then I could transfer the marks to my two center pieces and cut them out. Like I said, you don't have to do these. They sell bed hardware that does the exact same thing. it's just metal brackets. I just prefer wooden joints, so that's why I decided to do it. They don't have to be perfect. You're not ever going to see them, so it could be a good way to practice dovetails if you want to practice them. You can see I'm just going to transfer my marks. Now, if you are making a bed following these videos, and if I ever get around to it, the plans, you will not need to do this. The reason I have well, you'll need to do the center, but you won't have to do it with a double. The reason I'm doing a double is because I am repurposing bed slats from a double bed, and this is for a queen. So I'm basically have to make up about 6 to 7 inches of width, which is the difference in the size of a double and a queen, and I decided to do that in the center. So that's why if you've seen these, I've made a couple shorts of this bed. If you've seen this online, that's why I have such a weird looking mechanism in the middle of my frame. Like I said, if you're building your own bed, you won't have to do this unless you're also repurposing different size slats. So for the dovetail, I just start on the top side. I work about halfway down, could flip it over and finish it up. This wood is not the best to chisel because it is just a 2x6. So you can see I put a clamp on either side just so that I don't splinter any parts off, and I get it so it fits quite nicely. This oak I'm using just happened to be oak that I had laying around the shop that was about the same size as the 2x6. So you can see it's a little bit thinner and it's a little bit thicker, but for the purposes I'm using it for, scrap is fine. And then I could cut my 2 ends off and go about attaching these to the inside of the bed frame. And I'll have to do this 2 more times because, like I said, there's 2 center partitions. Now the first one of these I chiseled out thinking it wouldn't take super long, and it did. So this is the first one. You can see how it's going to slide into place, eventually be glued in place, but I leave this loose throughout the build, and in fact to the end, which I was very happy about, because once I put my mattress in place, I decided I wanted it lower. I wanted it to sit more inside the frame. So the fact that I never glued these actually made it possible to make that adjustment. So then for the other ones I'm doing, I'm not going to chisel them. I made a very quick jig. Basically, that center part there is going to be the exact same size as the dovetail piece I'm putting in there. I have nice big wide fences on the side, so the fence of the router can safely glide over the top of that. And it's also wide enough that I could clamp it on the top of the rail and the bottom of the rail, so it's nice and safe without impeding the fence of the router. So I just used a flush cut trim bit to get that done. It's about, I think it's a little over 1 inch thick, and then I could just go through and clean that up with a chisel because the router's going to leave it rounded over, and the dovetail bit I have is square. If you want to round over the dovetail bit edges, that works as well. And then this will slide into place. So like I said, I'll do 2 more of these because I already did one. And like I said, I left these loose, but you can see now with the dovetail, even with it not glued in place, how once you put these center partitions in, they can't go anywhere. So that's how that slides into place. And that's what it looks like from the top side. So like I said, there will be another one on the other side. So to join these 2 together, so taking this bed apart and putting it back together is easiest, I decided to join them with dados. You can use screws for something like this, but I already had the dado sack in my saw. I prefer wooden joinery over hardware, so that is what I decided to do. I just roughly marked about 6 inches for the whole length of the piece. I have a stop. I can cut those dados on all of the pieces. You can see I could flip it around and cut it end to end, so that with that stop and cutting them all at the same time, they'll mirror each other. And when I go to put it together, everything will fit perfectly. So I think this was about a 1/2 inch or so because I'm using scrap to fill these. The nice thing about this is when you glue everything together, this lumber is not the best quality, so it's going to bow and move. Clamping it and gluing everything together will keep everything nice and square and flat. And then for the slats, like I said, I'm just using some 2x6 scrap. I'm going to rip it down on the table saw to get it to the size of my dados, which, like I said, was I think about 5/16, and then I could cut everything down to size on the miter saw. glue everything together so everything's nice and strong, and then I could put my top side piece on and then clamp it all into place. Now I like to let stuff like this the glue dry with it in place. It's really important that this center piece aligns perfectly and stays perfect. So you can see I'm going to clamp it, and then I'm actually going to install it in the bed, so as it dries it matches the shape of the bed perfectly, so taking it in and out is not a pain going forward, because with the dovetails and the joinery, it does have to be kind of a perfect alignment. To finish this up, to mount the slats, I just took a 2x4. This does not have to be fancy, you're never going to see it. I cut it down to about 1.5 inches. I marked the thickness of my slats, which if you aren't repurposing like I am, they're usually about 1 inch thick. I think if you're doing it the way I'm doing it, where you have a center partition and 2 sets of slats, you could probably get away with using something like furring strips, which is 3/4 of an inch. But a lot of the times with brick beds I've worked on, this lumber is closer to 1 inch. And then I'm just using a laser level to level this out, and I'm attaching the whole thing up and down with wood screws. The other side of that partition will get one, and so will the other 2 edges of the beds. And then you can see the slats I have will fit into place. I feel like now that you see the slats in place, you could see the need for building up thickness in that center partition. So anything over a queen and up is usually the recommendation for adding a 5th leg or a center brace for this. Honestly, if I was making anything over a twin, I would add it. So overbuilt this severely, but I had this stuff laying around the shop from the build. So you can see I just cleaned up the edges of a 4x4, and I marked where that center partition is. I just put a lap joint on it so that it could sit right underneath of it. It'll hold the whole thing up in the center of the bed, and I won't have to worry about anything sagging over time. Like I said, this is severely overbuilt, but it is what I had. I don't think you'll ever be upset overbuilding stuff for furniture like this, a brace that you'll never see. So those are the 2 parts, and then I'm just going to join them with some dados and some scrap, so it's a 2-legged piece in the center there. So pretty easy. I'm using 3/4 inch poplar, so I'm just cutting a 3/4 inch dado in both of them. Once again, using a stop so that they align perfectly. I could slide it in place and glue this together. Now you can see when I cleaned up the edges of this 4x4 before I had a planer, that's how I would do most of my lumber. As long as the lumber is not severely bowed or twisted, if you don't have a planer and you want to make something like this, you can clean up those 2x6s in a similar way. The blade will only go up 3 inches, but you can flip it end over end and clean up those edges. It's a longer process. It is doable, but like I said, just make sure that your boards are pretty flat, because you are sending a lot of material through at once, and I'd recommend using a ripping blade. And then, like I said, I built this over the course of multiple months, so at this point I was switching gears to a new project. I had to take this whole thing apart. I stacked it in the shop. I didn't come back to it for about a month or 2.